So my name's Dr. Daniel Crabtree. I'm a Research Impact Officer at the University of Aberdeen, and I'll be co-hosting this webinar tonight. The Highlands and Islands Sport and Health Science webinar started this year, and this is our fourth one to date. And we have another few lined up for next year, which we'll inform you about later on. But for the time being, I'll just hand over to Gary to introduce himself.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Gary Warren, currently head of academy at Ross County Football Club. Just want to say a massive thank you to our three guest speakers tonight, and for everyone this signed up. It will be a great evening just to listen to some of the professionals we've got on here. But yeah, thanks again for turning up. Currently head of academy at Ross County, in charge of the males and females football program, from under 11s to under 18s. It's actually going quite well this year. So we're pleased with how we've started the season. So hopefully get to that Christmas period, and after the Christmas period, it will kick on again. But yeah, thanks again for everyone attending tonight.
Brilliant. Thanks, Gary. So I'll move us on to our first speaker, who is Ross Cairns. So Ross, you should be spotlighted there. And just to give a bit of background about Ross. So Ross is one of the leading coaches in performance athletics. Ross has been involved in endurance coaching for over 20 years, having coached athletes to national representation at British, European, world and Olympic levels. He was named 2020 and 2023 Scottish Athletics Development Coach of the Year. His athlete accomplishments include, but are not limited to, Megan Keith, who some of you might be familiar with. She's the current European Under-23 cross-country champion, British champion at 10,000 metres, and represented Team GB in the Paris Olympics. Mhairi Maclennan, the current British marathon champion and Scottish marathon and half marathon champion, and Luke Davidson, the current 800-metre Scottish national champion. So thank you very much for joining us tonight, Ross. Really appreciate it. And I'm going to hand over to you for your presentation. Okay.
Thanks, Dan. I'm just going to share my screen at the moment, and hopefully just give us a wee shout if we're all seeing that. And that's all, you all seen that?
Perfect. Yeah, we can see that. We can hear you fine. Thanks, Ross.
Great. Okay, so thanks, Dan. Good evening, everyone. Thanks for drawing the short straw and doing the first presentation. And I think what I'm going to try and do, and I don't have a screed of time, it's about 20 minutes, is to really paint a picture of the performance pathway and the concept that it exists in terms of its effectiveness as a talent pathway. Probably look at it from a practitioner point of view, in the sense that it's what emerged from my experiences as a frontline coalface coach for the last 20 odd years, and look at the kind of resources development and kind of suggest different types of pathways that might be applicable moving into maybe the next sector in terms of Olympic pathways, and the next run, which is for another 4 years. So I think Dan kind of quite quickly gave me a kind of a WhatsApp of what I've done over the last few times. I actually won the Performance Coach of the Year awards this year, which was only just last in November, and that was primarily due to the exploits of a certain young lady known as Megan Keith and Mhairi Maclennan, who had a really good London marathon, and just at the latter part of the year, Luke Davidson. So I think that's been mentioned. The key for me is I've done the hard yards of club coaching. I've not been an elite athlete parachuted into elite performance sport. I've had to start from the very, very beginning. So a lot of what I'm going to chat about tonight is from a practitioner's point of view. I have quite a strong coaching philosophy around developing a partnership with an athlete. I'm really big on listening. We'll get 2 eyes, 2 ears and 1 mouth. So I kind of look at it in that type of order. And I hope we kind of bridge that difference between commitment and involvement. So trying to get committed athletes, committed individuals involved in sport is really what we're trying to do. We got a lot of people that are involved in sport, but the commitment is the thing that we really need to develop to increase our numbers going into that later part of the pathway. In terms of athletes, I think you picked them all out there, but it's a small band that's grown. I've probably coached these athletes when they were kids, right the way through to most of them being at university or graduating. I'm not the only person involved in this. There is an assistant coach in Paul Davidson and a veteran athlete who actually trains with these athletes as well as being a female coach for me. So very much presenting this as a trio. And I think it's that analogy that it takes a village. That high performance approach, that collaborative environment is kind of key, and there'll be a message about that will come down the line in terms of the presentation. So in essence, what is a performance pathway concept? Essentially, at most sports, it's a structured progression. It's designed around individual development, and it's about peaking performance at the top part of our pyramid. The aim is to guide athletes from those early years, as it says there, typically around the ages of 9 and 10, all the way to Olympic success. The reality is that we've got 11 million people undertake sport in the UK, but there's only about 400 athletes competing in Olympic Games, and that was the number in Paris. So obviously 0.004%. And we've got to understand that the pathway is limited in what it tries to do. And I think we need a more broader, a more understanding of the recreational participation of our sport. Because if we go too hard too early, the issue is they're not about in terms of young athletes. And that mid-teen drop-off is evident in a vast number of sports that we have. So that's the kind of look that I want to kind of start off with. I think the other aspect is to think about this from the moment they start a journey and we guide them through those early years. Does that mean that we're trying to get them into the professional greatness and that every single club and every single sport has 20 young Olympians in it at the moment? Clearly they don't. And I think the message that we really need to look at is, can we adjust this performance pathway? I suppose the analogy I love is that it's trying to identify future orthopedic surgeons from their hand skills using scissors in a primary school craft class. We would never do that. Do we identify surgeons for primary education? No, we don't. Okay, so neither does elite children exist. Okay, and the challenge that we have is the deduction that elite sport doesn't exist in age group athletics, yet we make it exist. And we make it exist quite simply because we're maybe missing talent in certain areas of the performance funnel, or where our performance foundations that really start in the third to last stage of that basis. We kind of want to, it's a patience thing. We try and get them in a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier and a little bit earlier. So the reality of the talent pathway and the performance pathway are two slightly different things, okay? And what I'm really trying to put across here is that we want to try and follow an elite pathway, but the reality is that we maybe try and seek that out far too early in the process. And it would quite scare people of how early in some sports we have. And I'll paint the picture of sports that have an early pathway and sports that have a kind of late pathway. So I think the key thing is we love to look at our elites as an example of how a pathway is working, but we have to not escape the fact that most performing juniors never make it beyond that junior ranks. There's an overlay in today's 21st century. We have an overuse of metrics, times, places, and selection spaces. And if I was to ask you a question, what do Laura Muir, Jake Whiteman, Andy Butcher, and Megan Keith have in common? None of them were performance juniors. Most of them came late to the sport, and they displayed three common traits that research gives us, which is one, they really love what they do. So we can call that the environment, the culture, and the philosophy of the programs that they exist in really works for them. The second point is they don't really have an area obvious talent. So there's patience to develop that in terms of their skills. And the third thing is that they have a driven determination. There's a bit of resilience with those. Never more so have you seen Laura Muir's face running in the last couple of laps of a race to see it as an absolute prime example of determination. Okay. So what you could argue is the real concept of performance pathway is to enjoy, to persist, and to resist as much as possible in those early years. And my question to people on this webinar tonight, in whatever shape or form your sport is do we really allow them that opportunity? And I think there's a great example in Mark Cavendish. Mark Cavendish, you can see the quote there, I'm not going to read it out to you, but he basically says, in today's modern cycling, I wouldn't exist. Okay. And he wouldn't exist because our world's gone metric. He did not have the innate talent when he was younger. Mark grew up in the Isle of Man where it was windy, and he's quoted as saying, it was windy all the time in the Isle of Man, so I developed my techniques of going hard into the wind. That's how he developed his devastatingly fast sprint technique. Okay, so that brings two essential variables, culture and environment. The other one is patience and resilience. He was willing to grow and learn as a young lad in the Isle of Man, possibly not seeing himself as being the greatest decorated cyclist to ever be in the Tour de France at that particular point in time. But he had those qualities in abundance. Now, if you look at your pathway model, do you develop that? Do you recognize it? Do you foster it? Or do we look at other variables that are out there? And to paint a research picture of it, if you look at the very, very top of this slide, you'll see the near elites. These are the kids that never make it. And then the elite athletes. So the near elites are the pink line. And the kind of elite athletes, you see it and you kind of think to yourself, wait a minute, what's going on here? So if you look at it, and I'll spare you this analysing it, but the average near elite does more than 160 hours of practice before the age of 9. And whether you like it or not, whether you're in an early specialising sport like gymnastics or whether you're in a late specialising sport like athletics, the late and early specialising models that are used today, we kind of train to compete. We forget about the fundamentals and the learning to love the sport. Kids come into the sport because they see someone else doing a bit of a time, or it's distance, or it's whatever it is the metric that involves in your sport. And it's about trying to get them to understand that it is a long pathway. And there's maybe a question around how we portray that. And I think the challenge that we really have around that kind of data is, what do we actually say to our young athletes when we're going into a performance pathway concept? So it's about creating an environment and a culture that creates athletes that are committed, and they encourage themselves to keep showing up, okay, regardless of our early talent. I'm also a coach in a local athletics club, the only athletics club in Inverness. And, my view of that personally is that actually is a bit of a challenge to us, because all the really fast kids all come into Inverness Harriers, and we can only pick 2 kids in certain competitions. And the amount of kids that leave our system in the younger age groups because of that little narrow selection. There's an A and a B counter for track races for junior athletes in most district league competitions, and a certain minimum number of non-count athletes. Now, telling a young athlete you can't wear the club vest, you're non-counting, your performance doesn't count, and there's only 2 athletes that will count, sends the wrong message, doesn't it? And I think that's the radical shape of reform that's probably needed in a lot of our sports, okay? So the performance pathway concept, and the challenge that it has just now is that sport plus performance equals health risks, doesn't it? Yeah, sport plus performance early equals even more health risks, okay? So tell me if there's any of this aligns with the junior stages of your sports and all of you are on the call tonight, okay? Can you fall in love with a sport if your sport prevents you from doing it at senior phase in school? And that's quite a controversial one. So if you're the swimmer that's not allowed to be in the swim team for the school, if you're a footballer and you're not allowed to take part in the senior phase part of football in school, is it the runner that doesn't run for their school but runs in timed races? We call them BMC races in athletics. So it's about creating an environment and a culture that athletes are passionate about, isn't it? It's about encouraging them to keep showing up and striving for excellence regardless of that early talent. But it's also giving them a long-term development opportunity and a bit of personal growth versus short-term metrics of today and tomorrow's performance, isn't it? So the kind of simple example I can give you is what I call a non-linear progression. Megan's progression and a talent pathway is not your average. She started at the very bottom and went all the way up to the top in terms of the podium. It's a flexible development process. It's a journey that isn't straight. It isn't predictable. It isn't a fixed sequence of stages. The progression isn't involving rapid performance growths. It'll involve plateaus, setbacks, regression. And the challenge all around that is development. And that is the challenges and the opportunities that we need to take into this. So it looks like that pyramid on paper, but the reality is it's somewhat different, okay? Do we consider factors like mental resilience, the support of the external environment, personal circumstances? So, for example, smart and fast kids, so kids that are going to follow an academic process as just as much as they're going to go and get a scholarship in our case, athletics. So the non-linear progression emphasizes adaptability. It's about that continuous learning and understanding and development from setbacks and detours that contribute to that long-term development and success. And I think that's kind of key of where we're looking at this. When I kind of think of a performance pathway, I kind of look back to some of our athletes that I've coached in the last 20 odd years, the ones that made it and the ones that didn't make it. And when I mean the word made it, I mean that are actually in the senior ranks participating in our sport. They've not left after junior sport. And I think one comment comes out, which is meaningful intrinsic choices. So the athlete themselves made that choice, not a parent, not school. It was them that made that choice. And in Megan's situation, she dabbled in orienteering, she dabbled in rowing, she dabbled in hill running, she won Junior Master Chef. And those kind of things are a progression. They are on the development train of Megan Keith, the Olympian. But they're also part of, it's not all about coaching. It's that informal learning that's crucial. The helicopter parents with the elephant in the room don't generally produce senior champions. You can probably watch in our running sport the Ingebrigtsen's program and are having a very controlling father who's now going through the courts of the damage and car crash that can kind of create. The talent myth. Every young kid you see is going to be the next Usain Bolt. Most are made, few are born. The talent truth. 100% environment is crucial in this. And I think I need to highlight the importance of parents kind of trusting that process of development and understanding a little bit more, but also creating that supportive environment is so, so key. So there's an example of what happens if you late specialise, what happens if you early specialise. Early specialisation, more miles means medals, okay? Going early, the 160 hours at age 9 means that these kids are just more physically literate than the rest of their narrow age group. And the reality is that it's not going to develop anything further than that. And so I kind of strongly urge caution against early specialisation, and every kind of major performance programme will err against that. But we have performance programmes that will recruit at very, very young ages. And the kind of throughput is quite narrow in terms of the success rate of that. So in terms of where are we at the moment, so this non-linear talent identification, moving away from early identification of elite talent and focusing on some potentials that we have. And so I want to paint a picture very quickly of 3 normalised models that are about and the potential issues around that. So the first one is a pathway that's focused on a system, normally a national governing body system. They're pretty rigid. They do promote early specialisation, the focus on the short-term success. Even getting selected for an academy or even to remain in the academy becomes an issue of metric. Okay, these systems generally overlook individual differences. They create burnout. They prioritise winning over holistic growth. Okay, so that's one topic. The next one is performance pathways, focused on outcomes. Okay, this is the UK athletics system or the British swimming system. It's performance pathway, lack of flexibility again, overemphasize on metrics, limited support on mental and emotional development, and we can see some stories where it's come awry in certain programs. Massive athlete burnout, probably loads of injuries, and you remain on that program based on results. Okay, so let's look at it a different way. What if we had a pathway that was based on an athlete-centered coaching and a development prioritization? So we fostered a supportive culture, we encouraged autonomy, we build resilience, and we enhance motivation. Then what we do is we create that inclusive atmosphere where athletes thrive. Okay, it does require skilled coaching, and it does require strong organizational commitment to truly empower athletes. It's also majorly long-term and thus needs clubs, national governing bodies, executive support to wrap around it. And I hate to say it, for anyone that's a performance director, it's the easiest way to lose your job in performance sport is to do an athlete-focused version, because you might go long-term. And in terms of an Olympic sport, it's in cycles of 4 years in terms of funding. So the reality is all successful people, all Olympians, anyone achieving the highest level, have one ingredient in common. They have a support network. It's a family, it's a village. And the key elements they have is the environment, the direction, the access, the confirmation, and the development of all these things are the key aspects of what we call an athlete-centered coaching system. And I think that is essentially what we have and why we've had such a very good level of success in a pretty short space of time. 4.5 years essentially is the success, from Megan winning the under-20s in Dublin right the way through to Luke winning the national 800 metre title. We see the athlete and the coach as performance partners, as well as the club, the national governing body, the unis, the schools, or whoever's involved, and competition as a pathway partner, not the means to an end. And critical to success of that, again, is the culture and environment that you create. So I'm posing a few questions in the last minute here. It's understanding the issues. And these are generally things I want you to maybe take away when you're considering a performance pathway and certain conundrums that come up. So I'll normally just take the first one off each one. So talent models are that. They're just a model. They're very, very rarely seen. Okay. And I think that's a message that you want to try and think about. First point is, what's your environment? Okay. The most intelligent, most responsive of our species respond to the environment. So it's culture and environment. So for us, our athletes started wearing the same shoes. They made snowmen after training on a golf course in the winter training. They paced each other. They group. Part of the success was the wider success of the group. Have we got that? Second point is, what direction are you being pulled from? Is it supply and demand? Does fixture list lead your calendar and lead your development? Third point, where do they come from? Do you know where your athletes come from? Is it easy to access your pathway at 16 years old? Because that's where the majority of the athletes came from in my context. I have Luke and Lucas came from Ross County and Inverness Cally. I had Megan came from orienteering. I had Caitlin come from throwing background. And I think that is quite key. The fourth thing is confirmation of that talent. Could you spot it, or did you spot it? Did it just happen? What was the alignment? How did you see that happening? And understand where that confirmation occurs. So what level does that occur? And then the last one is really around development. Do you have a clear vision for it? Does this short 20 minutes, I think I'm about a minute over, does that actually help clear the mind of where the performance pathway really is? And hopefully that sets us up for the remaining talks that essentially we have. And thanks, guys, for listening. It's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, but there you go. Okay.
That was fantastic. Thanks, Ross. Really nice, honest presentation. Clearly very passionate about what you do. We're very lucky to have you in the north of Scotland, and well done to you and all your athletes and everything that you're striving towards as well. It's fantastic. I'm sure we'll have lots of questions later for Ross, so please feel free to note them down just now. We're going to move on to the next speaker, but please do post your questions in the chat now if you like. Me and Gary can take a note of them and ask them later on. We're going to move on to Gordon now, Gordon Mowat. So I'm just going to move the spotlight to yourself, Gordon, for your presentation. There you go. So, yeah, I've known Gordon for a wee while now, and I'm sure he won't mind me saying, very talented individual, very modest. So he'd probably be a bit embarrassed by that. But yeah, no, he's an excellent practitioner and student as well, from studying his Masters by Research at University of Highlands and Islands. So Gordon is currently a lecturer in sport and fitness at the University of Highlands and Islands, Perth. Just recently got that role, so congratulations, Gordon. And he's also a UK Strength and Conditioning Association, or UK SCA accredited strength and conditioning specialist with over 10 years of experience. Gordon recently, as mentioned, completed a Masters by Research studentship evaluating the Sport Scotland Performance and Development Programme. I think those findings are still being processed, but we'll hopefully hear a little bit more about them perhaps this evening, and a lot more about them later on in a future webinar. Gordon is also a consultant for Sport Scotland and has been and possibly still is a consultant for Scottish Rugby, and has previously been employed as a wellbeing coordinator with Live Active Leisure in Perth and Kinross. And finally, just to mention that Gordon is a former International Islands game athlete with whom he represented Orkney.
Excellent. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Dan. That was very generous. Yeah, the MRes is on its way. Final draft's been sent, so I will touch on some of what we found, within this. But when I was sort of racking my brains thinking about what the best topic to discuss would be, I thought back to my time working with the Athlete Academy. So it's an academy based in Edinburgh. We work with multi-sport athletes. And before taking on athletes, we would always have a consultation with the parents and the athletes. And one of the questions we would ask is, what can we do for you? What do you hope we can help you achieve? And probably 70% plus mentioned that they wanted to increase their speed. And commonly we found that the reason there was a perception that athletes were lacking in speed is because they were involved in academies, football, rugby academies, through the age grade system. So the athletes tended to be aged 10 to 18. So when they're playing against their peers, let's say they're age 14, you have your early developers, and oftentimes these athletes are finding they're being left in the dust because they were playing against people who may have been chronologically the same age, but were biologically a bit older. So I hope that through this presentation, you can take some practical breadcrumbs that can be applied in the context of your sports delivery program. It will touch on team sports, but there will be some practical implications if you're working with individual athletes as well. So the areas we're going to cover, we're going to talk about what we mean by the components of speed. So speed is multifaceted, it's multi-directional, it's complex. The development of speed is non-linear. So actually understanding what we mean by speed is really important. We're going to touch on the long-term athlete development principles in the context of speed development, but touching very slightly on physical preparation and how that can steer some of our practical implementation of our programs when we're trying to increase speed. We're also going to look at some practical methods, so how we can implement this into your training and how we can manage load and optimize training. So when we say manage load, that's looking at how we can optimize the way we plan things, so we're potentially reducing load and reducing the risk of injuries at certain ages and stages. So I will very quickly touch on growth and maturation. I won't dwell on this for too long because we have Steve talking after me, and I know him and his team in Bath have produced some of the kind of world-leading research on growth and maturation. But just to touch on it briefly, growth happens first, maturation happens afterwards. Happens at different stages, different ages for different athletes. And it's really important to understand this process so that we can make the best decisions for our athletes, so we can help them achieve their outcomes safely and effectively. So puberty influences speed, influences coordination, influences strength. In good ways and bad ways, we generally find that when athletes go through that sudden growth, their limbs get really long, everything becomes a little bit tight as their muscles are trying to catch up with their bones. That can have negative implications on coordination. So we often find that the athletes who come through our doors, they recognise there's a dip in performance, they can't understand it, and quite often it's just because of their age and stage. So they've gotten really long, really fast, they're not strong enough, and they're not coordinated enough to manage their body in space. So looking at the long-term athlete development framework, so I'll touch on this briefly at the end, but I would encourage anyone who isn't familiar with the long-term athlete development framework to have a look at the long-term athlete development network. So this is a group that produces a lot of really, really good podcasts talking about athlete development through the stages, through the ages, and you're going to find some really useful resources there. But the long-term athlete development framework, it's broken down into several stages. And looking at those in the context of speed development, I'll talk through these stages. The important thing to recognise when we talk about progression through these stages is that the things we're trying to implement in the training to win stage, so for 18 plus, that's built on the presumption that an adequate physical preparation intervention has been carried out through the previous stages. Okay, so if you have someone who is 18 years old but they have no exposure to physical preparation, no exposure to some sort of structured physical preparation intervention, then we're going to treat them similarly to how we would treat a younger performer. So we're not going to jump them ahead to the more intensity focused stages compared to an athlete that hasn't been through that process. So ages 6 to 9, this is termed fundamentals. So during this stage, in the context of developing speed, we are trying to work on fun, engaging games, things that involve multi-directional play, moving our body through space, body weight movements, in a sort of engaging environment. So slightly less onus is going to be placed on really specific skill development. Less onus is going to be placed on strength, force production, because at these ages, athletes don't really have the natural capacity to produce force. Okay, so it's only as we get through puberty we start to develop some of those characteristics. So ages 9 to 12, this is termed training to train. So this is where athletes are becoming slightly more emotionally mature, so they've got better understanding of specific skill development, and they're starting to get some of those natural potential to start to do things to higher standard in terms of force production. So during this age we want to focus on specific skill development, so a gradual introduction to different elements of speed, and a gradual introduction to the specifics of training speed as a skill in isolation. Then 12 to 16, so training to train. So through this age range, we probably see the biggest variation and discrepancies in growth and maturation. So we may have athletes who are pre-peak height velocity, post-peak height velocity, and that's going to really influence our decision making. But generally through this age range, we're now starting to put a bit more of a focus on speed endurance and building the strength to support speed. Now, when we talk about speed endurance, that doesn't mean being able to maintain a speed for a long distance. So you can't develop speed endurance by doing 1,000 meter reps. Okay, so speed is trained by doing things fast and intentfully. So when we talk about speed endurance training, we talk about repeat sprint abilities with full recovery. So we're able to produce that maximum speed for repeated efforts. And when we talk about strength and support speed, again, we'll touch on that in a moment, but that's going to be looking at, you know, physical literacy, movement competency, before we start to introduce higher intensity components of strength. Then we have training to compete, so ages 16 to 18. So this is where generally our athletes are starting to see the hormonal changes that allow them to produce more force. Okay, more force means higher potential for more speed. So now we can start to nurture those things. We can start to put a bigger focus on increasing the intensity and the load that our athletes are exposed to, assuming that we've gone through those previous stages. And then training to win, ages 18 plus, we now have young adults, so this is where we can start to refine things into more of a sport-specific context. So touching on physical preparation, now physical preparation, it's kind of a term that's sort of replaced strength and conditioning. It's a slightly more holistic term compared to strength and conditioning. So what we mean by physical preparation is helping people to prepare themselves for whatever they're going to be doing in their sport. Okay, so if we look at football, we've got athletes who are reaching high speeds, they're coming into contact, they need to change direction quickly, they need to land from height if they're jumping up in the air, they need to be able to move from awkward positions. So we need to give people that practical toolkit to manage some of those challenges faced within their sports. Okay, so some of the stages of physical preparation, and these can align with the previous slide where we look at the stages of the LTAD framework. But initially we're going to place a big emphasis on foundational training, so developing body weight strength, mobility, coordination. Okay, so where you have young athletes with no exposure to strength training and conditioning, we are going to focus on doing a big variety of movements and becoming strong with body weight. As we get to the point where athletes can competently do certain things, like body weight chin-ups, variations of single leg squats, hinge at the hips, single leg jump and land, push-ups, this is where we can start to place more of an emphasis on intensity. So where we're working at those earlier stages, it's really important that we gradually and progressively overload the volume, but not the intensity. Okay, so the way that might look in a practical context is week 1, we're going to do a stepping lunge. We're going to do 3 sets of 6. Week 2, we're going to do 3 sets of 8 for the same exercise. Week 3, 3 sets of 10. Week 4, 3 sets of 12. The next training block, we're going to increase the complexity of the skill. So now we're going to do a lunge, but we're going to have an offset kettlebell. We're going to hold the weight to one side, change the dynamics of the exercise, and we're going to go back to 3 sets of 6, then 8, then 10, then 12. Okay, so building up that volume and the complexity is just going to equip our young athletes with the skills they need to produce better performances in their sport and then to progress on to higher intensity training. Okay, so once we've built this foundation, this is where we can start to progressively overload higher intensity. Okay, so when we have athletes with those early skill components developed, now we're going to start shifting the focus away from increasing volume continuously. We might keep the same repetition range, but we're going to start to gradually increase load. So how that may look, we may have a kettlebell goblet squat. Week 1, we're doing 3 sets of 6 with 12 kilograms. Week 2, same reps, now we're on 14. Week 3, same reps, we're on 16, etc., etc. So that's where we start to increase intensity when our athletes have the capacity to handle that. And then eventual introduction to sport-specific movements using dynamic correspondence to guide exercise implementation. So when we talk about sport-specific, and this is quite a contentious subject in strength conditioning, so sport-specific doesn't mean exactly replicating a skill in a sport and making it heavier. So using the example of golf, if we want to increase the distance of a golfer's drive, we're not going to have them hit the ball with a heavy club. Okay, that's going to negatively impact their performance. I'd be interested to see it. It sounds quite entertaining to watch, but it's probably not safe. It's going to be too specific. We're going to get caught in that specificity trap. When we talk about sport specificity, we mean replicating some of the joint angles, some of the forces, some of the directional movements, directional changes within a sport, and overloading those progressively. Okay, so that brings us around to speed. Okay, so speed should be developed in tangent with developing the physical capacity to produce speed. Okay, so they shouldn't happen separately. There should be an element of both involved in most effective programs. So components of speed, as I mentioned previously, it can be broken down into multiple skills, and each one is a skill in its own sense, and it's really important to treat them as such. Okay, so speed on its own is a variety of skills. So that can include reaction, acceleration, so reaching top speed quickly, deceleration, so stopping suddenly, stopping gradually, cutting, so change of direction, shuffling, so lateral shuffling, jockeying, backpedaling, and max velocity, so sustained top speed. More factors in there as well. We can have curvilinear running, things like that as well. But when we're training the components of speed, it's really important to make the main thing the main thing. So if our session is focused on developing acceleration, for example, we train that skill in the same way that we would train a free kick in football, a passing drill, a dribbling drill in hockey. Okay, so we train those skills in isolation in the context of that sport, and we need to do the same thing with speed. Okay, so these steps are really important. So emphasize that skill acquisition before introducing really high intensity drills and using a suitable progression. So looking at some practical examples, and we'll stick to acceleration initially. So if we want to train acceleration, we need to understand the mechanics of the skill. So we may use drills like wall drives, where we have athletes standing with their hands on a wall, leaned at a 45-degree angle, and in that drill, they're trying to punch their knees forward, punch their foot back, making sure the foot lands behind their base of support so that they can simulate producing those horizontal forces that are required in acceleration. Okay, so once that skill has been effectively demonstrated, we can progress it. So we may move on to something like a tall and fall drill. So have the athletes on a start line, lean forwards until they feel they're about to fall, and then punch that knee and accelerate forcefully for 5 to 10 meters. Okay, so spending time on this, we may do 3 sets of 6 of these each. That's going to give the athletes a fair bit of exposure and enough chances to repeat the skill so that it can start to become reinforced. Once that skill is developed to a level that they're doing it, for multiple reps with good technique, then we start to advance the complexity of the skill. And this is where we look at different stimulus. Okay, so in hockey, an athlete is going to react to an external stimulus. They're not going to react to their own decision making necessarily. They may see something, they may hear something. So in the context of training that skill, we may have athletes on a start line. They're going to react to a clap. When they hear that clap, they're going to sprint to 10 meters. We may progress that into an arm signal. So when the arm goes down, the athlete sprints. So now they're reacting to a visual stimulus. Once that's been developed, then we can add a competitive element. So we may have athletes racing to 10 meters, 20 meters, and then we can add an element of chaos. So this is where we start to make things a bit more connected to the complexities of movement in sport. So this may have us, having an athlete on a start line, another one standing at arm's length behind them, the athlete in front starts sprinting, the athlete behind has to react to them and try to tag them on the shoulder. Okay, so there's an example of how we may progress this skill to a point where now we're able to use it in a game environment now that the skill has been suitably reinforced. Similarly, when we are working on cutting as a drill, we quite often see in certain academy sports, quite often in football, we're working on change of direction with a football at our feet. Okay, so we're going to run to the cone, receive a pass, dribble in a different direction. So suddenly by adding in the football, we've lost the skill of change of direction. Okay, so when we're trying to work on that skill of change of direction, it should be done forcefully, it should be done well, and it should be progressed suitably. So we may progress that drill by having an athlete sprint to a cone, plant their foot, cut, change direction, and then we're going to reinforce certain elements of that skill. So we're going to reinforce accelerating into the turn, planting the foot outside of the base of support, rotating the hips, re-accelerating. Okay, reinforce those elements of the skill. Then we may add a new stimulus again. So similar to the acceleration drills, we may have them react to a clap. So run in a straight line. When you hear the clap, you're going to cut, change direction. Then we can add a competitive element. So similarly to the acceleration drill, may have one athlete in front, one behind. Athlete in front sprints, decides if they're going to carry on a straight line or if they're going to cut. The athlete behind has to mimic them, try to tag them on the shoulder. Okay, so this is what we mean by training the skills in isolation before complicating them. And this is something I would strongly encourage, especially team sports, to spend a bit of time on within the context of your session. So a suitable warm-up that includes some form of ramp protocol, raise, activate, mobilize, potentiate, some kind of mobility emphasis, and progress that into a speed drill. So spend 10-15 minutes on that speed drill before we then go into that game environment. Okay, so that's going to help our athletes get the most out of those drills. It's going to develop the technique required to do those drills effectively, and it's going to have a better carryover to the context of a sports setting. So something that's important to consider as well, and this is going to be more applicable to our athletes that are at that slightly later stage of growth maturation, where they've had more exposure to some of those early stages of physical preparation, is the force-velocity relationship. Okay, so to move quickly, we need to be able to produce force. Okay, to move with power, we need to have high velocity and high force. So in strength conditioning, we do something called surfing the curve. So you'll see this wee diagram here. On the y-axis, we have force. On the x-axis, we have velocity. So we need to consider that as force increases, velocity decreases. Okay, and as velocity increases to some extent, force decreases. So spending time at both ends of that spectrum and along that spectrum is going to help us to get the most out of our athletes. Okay, so if we spend some time building strength, working at different percentage loads, you'll see on the y-axis here, maximum strength, 90 to 100% 1 rep max, maximum velocity, less than 30% 1 rep max. So working along that curve is going to nurture the qualities and the capacities that are going to allow our athletes to move faster. Okay, so something that's really, really important, especially if you're working with team sports. Again, while I've been working with different academies in my kind of contract roles, one of the common issues we see is an inappropriate amount of running volume. Okay, so especially in football, rugby, we may have athletes doing Broncos before a session. So Broncos, essentially a shuttle run where they run about 1.2 kilometers. So where we have a really high excessive amount of running load, we're really starting to expose our athletes to higher risk of certain injuries. So things like Osgood-Schlatter's, Sever's disease, Sinding-Larsen-Johansson syndrome. So some of these growth-related injuries are, usually caused by an inappropriate amount of loading. Okay, and often that loading comes in the form of running. So something that's really important if you're working in a team sport setting, get to know the requirements of the sport. So if you're in an academy or a structure that has the funds to allow something like Catapult, so where you can gather GPS data, you can find out how far your players are running, how many times they're reaching top speed, how many times they're running at 50% speed, how many times they're changing direction. That data can really feed into our decision making within our training. However, if we don't have access to that, we can still eyeball it to an extent. So count how many times our athletes are sprinting, in a game, how many times they're having to run out, track back. And then in the context of our training, so especially at a young age, we don't need to exceed that. So if we are running 5 kilometers in a game of football, we don't need to run 10 kilometers in our training. That's just inappropriate loading. It's going to exacerbate some of those injury risks. So focus on doing things well, and especially with younger age groups, quite often less is more. So doing less with better technique is going to have better long-term outcomes than doing more with bad technique. And again, tying it back into speed, there we go. So tying it back into speed, if we have a speed session, make the main thing the main thing. So don't have your athletes running 60 meters 10 times with a 1 minute recovery, because now we're not running fast enough. Okay, so we're fatiguing our athletes to the point where they can't run at maximum speed. We're also exposing them to risks by having them run under fatigue, potentially techniques going out the window. We are exposing our athletes to risk of injury. Okay, so an optimal running load distribution ensures long-term performance, and it reduces the risk of injury. So some of the common errors we see in speed training, so touched on these already. So overtraining without adequate recovery. If we're doing things intentfully and with high impact, we need to give the athletes a chance to recover fully. Okay, so in sports where there's a lot of jumping, landing, bilaterally, unilaterally, we need to manage that load. So we don't want to exceed, a really high number of contacts. So if we have netball athletes, we quite often see 13-year-old netball players with knee braces, ankle supports, and it's because in their sport, they're jumping an average of once a minute for 60 minutes. That's 60 contacts at unpredictable angles, unpredictable landings. So similarly for speed, we need to manage that load. Start small, gradually and progressively increase. So treat your athletes like the training intervention is a long-term thing. So start small, and then we're going to produce better results longer term. Okay. So looking at some of the practical applications of what we've talked about. So using age-appropriate drills and games. So trying to understand what stage of development your athletes are in, what their exposure already is in terms of physical preparation. So try to understand their biological age, their chronological age, and their training age. So those three factors are really pivotal in our decision-making process when it comes to programming for our athletes. So using things that are age and stage appropriate, even if that means mixing up your age groups. Okay, so you may have a rugby team. I know that over in New Zealand, we're seeing more biobanding where athletes are playing against other players who are at similar stages of growth and maturation to them. So in your training, that's a really good way to go about things. So instead of having all your 16-year-olds train together, have a look at their age and stage. You may have a 16-year-old who is biologically 12. So consider, mixing up the age groups. I'm conscious of time here, so I'm going to very quickly go on to the next slide. I'm not going to dwell on this one, so looking at peak height velocity, because I know that Steve will touch on this in greater depth, but something really important to consider. I believe you'll be circulated this slide pack, so feel free to have a read through this, but understand what pre-peak height velocity is, what peak height velocity is, and post-peak height velocity, and try to make our decision-making based around that. Some useful references here. I would suggest if you're interested in going into some of these in greater depth, check out some of these references. There's some really good links here. And thank you very much for listening. Sorry if I ran over slightly there, Dan. So let me stop sharing there.
That was excellent. Thanks very much, Gordon. I'm going to hand over to Gary to introduce Steve, but just to say that was a fantastic run through, Gordon, and thanks very much for those practical messages at the end as well. That was great.
Thanks, Gordon. Yeah, excellent, mate. Speed, something that I wasn't blessed with, so I would probably taken paid a bit more attention as I was growing up. But thanks for that. Okay, we'll move on to Steve. Steve, grateful to have you with us tonight. Just a little bit about Steve and kind of his background. Steve's a sports scientist with the Scottish Football Association, working with kind of various squads. He's currently working hard on a project for Club Academy Scotland regarding growth and maturation monitoring. The purpose, I think, to get a deeper understanding of kind of the maturation status across Club Academy Scotland. And if I'm right in saying, Steve, trying to kind of have the aims of officially hosting kind of biobanding tournaments and putting together a kind of future program for late developers to hopefully compete in the national competitions. Steve is also founder of the Athlete Culture and was a successful athlete, and also was the head of academy performance at Hibernian and Dunfermline Football Club. Also, this is really interesting, this, Steve, so I'd like to pick your brains on this. Competed in the BBC Special Forces event, Ultimate Hell Week. So we're very, very lucky to have you. And I'll pass it over to you now, mate.
Yeah, we can chat about that another time. So yeah, I'll just get the screen up just now. Okay, can everybody see that? Yeah. So obviously when Dan first asked me to present on this, it was first kind of wanted to touch on a little bit about football fitness, but my biggest passion is obviously growth and maturation, and I'm going to talk how that all comes together and how, for me, I feel growth and maturation really underpins the whole thing when it comes to not just football fitness for developing players, but for actually any sport, just as Ross highlighted at the beginning of the evening. So, and just like what Ross was mentioning about early specialisation and later specialisation, football has a huge issue with the fact is that it predominantly is a very early specialisation sport. Yeah, I can even talk about that within my own home. My son is football daft. I tried to get him into karate, gymnastics, tennis, all these different other sports, but football is the only thing he wants to do, and he just refuses to do another sport. So as a practitioner, it really bothers me, but as a parent, you've got to do what makes them happy, and that's what he's happiest doing. So I can see it from 2 points of view here. So yeah. Anyway, I'm gonna get into the whole football fitness and athletic development for creating professional footballers. So a wee bit about who I am, as Gary very kindly and generously introduced me there. I actually started off my career as a sports science technician where I worked with Daniel. I mean, Daniel were colleagues at Napier back in the day. And then from there, I jumped ship into football, where I worked as an academy sports scientist. And then I was head of the department for the majority of my time at Hibs, where I ended up forming a wee side hustle, Athlete Culture, which is pretty much taking in the athletic development model that I had within Hibs and just mass-produced it for everybody, because I genuinely believe that these types of programmes shouldn't just be for the chosen few, just like Gordon mentions with the Athlete Academy in Edinburgh. Terrifically ran programme by Rob Anderson there. It's very, very similar thing. But there in what year did I start with SFA? 2023. The beginning of 2023, I joined in with the SFA as one of their national squad sports scientists, and they very kindly put me through a PhD with Professor Sean Cummin, who is regarded as the world leading authority in growth and maturation. So if you've ever heard anything about biobanding, he was pretty much key behind that concept of implementing that into the professional football clubs. So I'm currently in my second year of my PhD. From here, there we go. So first of all, what is football fitness? And before we do with anything in any sport, we need to create what's called a needs analysis. So what's the need? What do you need to be able to do? What is your job as a professional footballer? So typically, within a 90-minute game of football, we'll find that a player will cover between 10 to 13 kilometres, depending on position. They can run anything between 800 to 1400 metres of high-speed running, so anything roughly pretty much 20 kilometres plus, with about 300 to sometimes 500 metres of above 25k. So that's pretty fast. And some of the top speeds, as Gordon was mentioning earlier, the air speed is a huge thing. We've had players hit 37 kilometres an hour. So just to put that into context, Usain Bolt during the 2008 Beijing Games clocked 44 kilometres an hour. So just to put it into perspective, this is real live data that we've collected within the Premier League and Scottish football. And again, adding in the high intensity actions there. So how do we prepare a youth to be able to do that? Now, that's without the ball. So I'm a huge fan of, we've brought up already, the LTD models. I have always really fallen back to the youth physical development model by Rodri Lloyd. For me, it's one of the few that really works around the maturational state and states of growth. Again, because for me, I generally believe the key principle to long-term athletic development is making sure that your growth and maturation assessments and observations are really, really nailed down. And again, what kind of traits that will you be touching on as you go through that model? Now, I'm just going to fire through that because Gordon very excellently just touched on pretty much all that. So I'm not going to bore you more with that. How I've always done that as well, regardless, exactly what Gordon says, if you're 18-year-old or you're 11-year-old, you come back into this, I've always used the 5-pillar model, but you go right back to the start. So for me, you always have to create a stable athlete, a mobile athlete. Once you know they're stable and they're mobile, that's when I'll develop strength qualities, if able, and within the maturational phase. From there, move on to speed, strength, strength, and then we develop power. Again, Gordon touched on that beautifully earlier. However, one thing I hadn't been touched on so far is assessments. So there's a phrase I love: if you're not testing, you're guessing. So to make sure that you're actually, how's your athlete growing and developing through your model? Well, you need to make sure that you've actually got some type of testing battery. So here's just a whole load of assessment performance tests that I've used over the different organisations and institutions I've been involved in. A lot of it is resource dependent, and others, if I've, like for example at Hibs, like we had a lot of resource, so we could do a lot more, but with athlete culture, because obviously it's my own side business, I'm not privy to a lot like the jump mats or the 4 sticks. I've just got timing gates, so I'll just look at like a standing long jump, a 5 metre and a 20 metre sprint. However, if I'm in a football club and I've got like a Nord board and 4 sticks, that's when I'll go to town on looking at RSI, so reactive strength index, current movement jump, braking force, so looking at the ground reaction forces. But one of the things that I've always done is growth and maturation testing alongside of that. So how we do growth and maturation testing, we take the height and the weight of the child, we take the biological parent's height, and we use predominantly the Cami-Roche method. Oh, that's spelt wrong as well. There's an H after the K. In times gone, I'd use the Murwell method. However, it's massively inaccurate. You're looking at it's about 40% accurate. Now, at the end of the day, especially when you're working within academy football, you are making decision on people's lives. And this data can actually massively inform that decision-making process. So if you're using methodology, which is around 40% accurate, you're flipping a coin. And it's not fair on the child, it's not fair on the parents, and it's, at the same time as well, it can have huge implications for the development of the child within the club. So the Cami-Roche method has been shown to be around 90% accurate, with an estimated error of 2.2 centimetres on estimated adult height. So we'll do a bit of testing. So this is real data, again, through Moan Athlete Culture. So this is how I put together a report. So I've always used a typical traffic light system. Now these KPIs, which you'll see across the top, so for 5 metre, 20 metre, change of direction on the right or left foot and a standing long jump, that's just derived from a bank of data that I've collected across in my time in academy football, and I just traffic light it based on the scores that I've collected. And again, I've just done that using Z scores. We can go into the statistical side of that later if anybody's super keen to know a little bit more about that. And at least this way we can see how they're developing, what their individual strengths and weaknesses are here. So with this particular team, you can see that the main need here is the MAS, maximal aerobic speed test, because there's more reds there. So again, when you're presenting that back to a coach or an athlete, they can instantly see what, again, what's the needs of the team? How's everybody looking? However, we normally use this information to inform a training intervention as well. So again, within the athletic development programme, you should have the fail to plan to fail. You should always have a typical training plan based on the resources that you have available. So again, I normally just use a very easy BOMPA period style of periodisation. I think he was quoted earlier within, I think it was Gordon's presentations there. I'm a big fan of his methodology. And then from there, we retest. So how did they get on? We look at the difference between like an 8-week block. That's how I'd work it with athlete culture. I usually go into boys clubs teams and do an 8-week block, or I'll send the coaches in, and then we just look at, right, over that course of that training, what happened? Oh, we've got a 10.2% improvement in counter movement jump, a slight improvement in acceleration, wee improvement in changing direction on the right and the left boot. Jumped ahead there, so we can see that way pre and post that has this training intervention had a positive impact. Well, yes, it has. And there's a little bit more greens on the screen there, so we can feed back to the coach that, yep, we're quite happy that the players have responded in a good way. And again, looking at this over time, so like I said, long-term athletic development, testing is ultimately just a snapshot in time of that exact moment, but that's not really what we're interested in. We're looking at the long-term athletic development of the player. And one of the things that's really important to notice that performance improvements isn't always linear. Now, if we look at the regression lines, they actually show, yeah, they're going in the right way. Obviously, with speed, you want it to go down because obviously it means you're getting faster. And again, this is just done with very simple timing gates. I use the Brouwer timing gates and a measuring tape. So simple, and you can get real meaningful impact data. So I'll present that back to the player, give it to the parent, give it to the coach, and we can just see, right, this player is positively responding over, how long's that? I think that's a year and a half. Nearly over this training course. So yeah, he's going in the right direction. So, right, touching on, now it's going to start beginning the journey of growth and maturation. I just wanted to touch on a little bit about the training to get to that point. So Alex Ferguson, a lot of this stuff actually derives from Alex Ferguson, or Sir Alex Ferguson. Should use his official title. We're all Scottish here mostly, so I have to give them the credit for probably being the greatest ever manager to play the game. He said one of the greatest, this was in his book on leadership, and he said one of the greatest gambles that he ever taken in football was investing his time in a later developing boy. And given that later developing boy the time, he could have a potentially greater potential later down the line. And it's great because obviously we've touched on that already in the two previous presentations. Particularly with Ross, with the later specialising athletes coming in athletics later, and Alex Ferguson, he was one of the first to actually identify this. So again, what is growth and maturation? I'm just going to quickly summarise it and go into a little bit more detail. So peak height velocity has been mentioned so far tonight, but what exactly is it? It's the point in life where you go through your significant growth spurt. So everybody goes through that growth spurt at slightly different times. Okay, first of all, there's a difference between boys and girls. Girls will typically go through it 2 years before boys. Boys will go through the growth spurt between the ages of 12 and 14, and the average is 13.8. Girls will go at between the ages of 10 and 12. When, particularly with boys, when you go through that, you get huge hormonal changes. And exactly what Gordon mentioned earlier, these hormonal changes with the testosterone and the growth hormone can bring in an abundance of strength, speed and power. However, if it's not managed correctly over that time, you're just going to be putting yourself and exposing yourself to exposed growth-related issues or injuries, however you want to look at it. And this could be a huge problem, especially within a performance pathway such as an academy football, because if you're going through that period of life, like Gordon mentioned earlier, you get adolescent awkwardness, your limbs have just shot up, you can go through a massive performance dip. So, for example, in a footballing context, your range of passing's off, your touch is gone, you can't really run. You know, a coach will turn to me and go, Steve, I'm guessing he's going through his growth spurt. And I'm like, oh, why are you saying that? It's because he can't run. Of course he can't run. His limbs have just shot up, he's not got control of his body. But given time and breathing space, that player can come back. However, what happens if you go through it at different ages? That's where you can become an early, late or on-time developer. And that has implications for the retention and release of players as well, which is a huge part of my work within the SFA. So here's a great example. Probably our greatest player at the minute for the Scotland A squad. He was released by Celtic. Great wee article here for being too small. However, you think to yourself, that was probably what back then a £50 million decision by the club. Just absolutely insane. So you can see there's huge financial costs to these decisions. And if you're not monitoring growth and maturation, you're going to be missing these wee hidden gems within your own system. If there was better practice within the club at that point in time, they would have identified, okay, he's a later developing player, he's going through his growth spurt potentially, he's going for a performance dip, he's not got strength, speed and power, let's just give him time to breathe. However, maybe Andy needed that. Maybe he needed to be exactly what Ross was touching about, environmental factors earlier, when Mark Cavendish, hammering it into the wind. Probably a big part of that developing mental toughness and a bit of robustness there. Maybe that's what Andy Robertson needed as well. There's something there called the underdog hypothesis, where these later developing players, through the underdog hypothesis, always being the small wee guy, develops a lot of different skill sets psychologically that can make them top performers. Again, what Ross was talking about was the environment. 100% environment could be a thing here. So how does it look like real life on the park? So again, here's a great example. Two players, under 14, essentially the exact same age. One lad's literally half the size, and this is real stuff. So typically with growth, like it was mentioned earlier, growth comes first, then maturation. A child will typically grow 5 to 6 centimeters a year and put on 2 to 3 kilograms a year up until the age of 9. Now, if you're a very early developer, you'll go through that growth spurt at the age of 9. Very, very early developer, may I add. And that can go up to 10 to 12 centimetres a year. However, right now within Club Academy Scotland, so that's all the professional academy systems within the SFA, the clubs are obviously sending me in their data for growth and maturation. I monitor it from afar. There's actually players right now hitting 21 centimetres a year. Now, I've said back to the sports scientist at the club, I was like, I'd be surprised if he's not tripping over his own feet. And then that's what I got replied, like, yeah, like when he's walking through a door, his shoulders bump into the door, he's got he just knocks over things all the time. So yeah, again, that's why we should be monitoring this. And again, that picture really epitomises the variation in pubertal timing. So you've very much got an early developer on the left, and you've got a late developer on the right. So how do we classify status of maturation? So again, like I say, we use the Cami-Ross method because that's the most reliable, most accurate. So when it comes to decision making on players, what they need from an individual point of view, we can hand on a heart say this is what the best thing is what they need. Cami-Ross method will give us an estimated adult height. And then from the estimated adult height, we can work a percentage of predicted adult height. And this is how we classify it. So if you're PHV, peak height velocity, you're pretty much anything below 85%. If you're circa, you're 85 to 96. And if you're post, so like was mentioned earlier, that adult-like body is pretty much 96 plus percent of your predicted adult height. What we can see here is that we've got, this was work from Xabi Monasterio and Athletic Balbao, I always say Balboa, I think I'm Rocky there, and we're looking at the early, on time and late developers. So we can see the early developers, there's one lad there pretty much from the age of 10, their growth spurts, so this is something that we need to understand is the tempo, their growth spurts are very, very intense, but very, very short. However, when we go over to the later developing players, what happened obviously, 14, 15, 16 to 17, we can see that their growth spurts, that peak height velocity phase, that goes on for longer. So that's a longer period than what the early developers would be going through. Now, that can come with huge problems as well. So first of all, these guys don't have the strength, speed, power, but they're also more susceptible to growth-related injuries. So again, work by some of our colleagues, David Johnson, when he was at Bath, but when he was at Bath, he did his PhD at Bournemouth. He's now the head of athletic development at West Ham. He did this fantastic study where he reported where is the estimated injury risk with growth-related injuries based on the percentage of predicted adult height. And what we can see is pretty much between 90 to 95% of predicted adult height, that's where you're 115% more likely to increase in incidence, and 225 in burden. So incidence is how many hours per 1,000 athlete hours, and burden is pretty much how many athlete days. So we can see there when you're through that period, particularly the 90 to 92%, so right in the thick of the growth spurt, that's when your injury risk is at its highest. And as mentioned earlier, we grow from a distal to proximal pattern, so our feet, hands, legs, arms, and then our body, and then injuries tend to follow that way as well. So that's where we'll get severs in the heels, then we'll get Osgood Slatters in the knees, and then eventually it'll work into spondylosis and PARS in the back. And that's what we tend to find as a typical pattern for growth-related injuries. So if we zoom in a little bit closer into the player, right, what we can see here. So this is real data taken on the 10th of October last year from a club. So first of all, we can see is that chronologically, the player is 14.6-year-old. He's 92.7% fully grown of his percentage of predicted adult height. His predicted adult height is 187 centimetres. He's going to be a big guy. However, if we go down to the second bottom, we can see his biological age is 14.3. So he's an ever so slightly later developing player, ever so slightly. However, we can also see his growth tempo is 6.2. So he's going through a period of growth. And because there's repeated measures on this boy, we can see, well, yep, he is a high potential for growth. So what we would do is we would watch him, we'd monitor him, we'd know, yep, he's right in the thick of the growth spurt. He's going through a period of significant growth. Is he displaying any symptoms of growth-related issues? Knee pain, heel pain, lower back pain? If not, let's crack on. We can probably continue as normal because we don't want to modify the training too much because that'll effectively hold him back. However, if he's starting to display growth-related issues on top of that with this type of data, that's when we can start modifying the training. So what was kind of presented earlier there about, minimising impacts, forces, dropping the intensity. Now, that's not always the answer. That's what I'm saying is that it has to make sure you've got a checklist because ultimately you will be holding back the development of the player. However, if these things are all there and you've got you can create a point system, then you go, right, let's put him into what we could call a growers club. So we modify the training so we know he's going to sail through it. So how does it look? What does the current state of Scottish football look like right now? So this is real life data. This is data that I've collected. So right now in front of you, you're looking at the largest study ever conducted in growth and maturation in football in the world. We're the first people to ever do a nationwide study in growth and maturation screening. So I'm really proud to present this work as on behalf of the SFA. So what we can see, every dot on that screen is a player. Across the x-axis, that's the bottom one, we can see that's age, and the y-axis is the z-scores of maturation timing. So we can identify where all our early, on-time and late developers are. Now the sad state of affairs here is what you can see as age increases, so does the bias towards the early developer. We can see around the age of 12 to 13, we've got the largest variation of early, on-time and late. So we've got the most extreme early and the most extreme late. However, this wee pocket here, this is where we're potentially losing our most talented players. Now, this instantly tells me players are being deselected or released from the academy pathways, and it's very obvious and evident that it's based on strength, speed and power, not a technical, tactical decisions. And again, this is where the whole conversation is. Are we developing players to win on Saturday because you're playing Rangers or Celtic at under 15s? Or do you want to actually pick a player that's got the potential to play against Rangers or Celtic at first team level? Because that's two different things. Now, we need to change the narrative on winning games at under 15s does not mean a successful academy. A successful academy is an academy that can make a successful transition from part-time to full-time football and then have a good pathway into that first-team environment and then survive, not just survive, but thrive in a career in the game. If we're zooming a little bit further into that box, this is the under 15s of last year, so the 2009 age group. Again, same X and Y axis, but now all the dots, they're identified by biological age. Now within the under 15s age group, we can see that our youngest player biologically, now this is real data by the way, is 13 years old. However, our oldest player is biologically 18. So we've got a biological variance of 5 years within the one chronological age group. So that's if you are effectively getting a 13-year-old to compete against an 18-year-old. That is what is genuinely happening right now. So a huge, huge issue when it comes to identifying talent. How does that look across the board? So again, when we look at early on time and late developers, we can see under 10, that's the smallest minority is early developers, and the on-time and lates are pretty much the exact same. On-time developers throughout the whole academy system remain relatively constant, However, what we can see at that under 12 to under 13 crossover, we can see that you get this meteoric rise in early developers, and then there's a drop off in late developers. Again, it really strengthens the bias of, are we selecting the right players? Because if you're just telling me all the best talented players within Scotland are all early developers, I'm going to call you a liar. And again, I'm sure Gary will testify, I've done this presentation at Handon at the Heads of Youth, and it's the exact wording that I've used, and it's the exact data that I've shown them. So how does it look when you actually compare? These are different players, A, B, C, D, within a professional club that I've worked with, and we compare them. So we're looking at all the performance testing that I demonstrated at the beginning of the presentation, and then I've compared them against their age group and their maturational group peers. And what the story tells you is, for player A, we can see that this pretty much tells you for age group, he's average to okay. However, we compare him for his maturation, the scores are off the chart. Vice versa for B, what it tells us is that his age group is actually relatively poor, but maturation is unbelievable. He's a one to watch. I'm thinking player B is a real athlete here. Player C, we can see that player C, he's not having a good time. He's poor. He's really poor for age group. And guess what? He's even worse for maturation across the tests. I think the conversation needs to be held here, because when we're actually looking at his athletic potential is not as potentially as high. And player D, right in the thick of the growth spurt, who knows what's going on with this guy? Cannot make a decision on him. Right, let's just not, because he's in the thick of the growth spurt. His performance results are everywhere. How does this look long term for a late developer? What we can see here, that exact same graph that pretty much tells us, I couldn't do the jumps with him at that point because he was in the thick of the growth spurt and his odds good slatters were horrific. So I don't jump him because it's too sore. And we can actually see with his standing long jump, yep, it was very, very poor for age group and it was still poor for maturation. Okay, that's something that we can deal with. But we can see back then his yo-yo, that's the one I did, was decent. He's changed the direction test for his maturational peers were really good. 20-metre sprint, really good. And his age group, he was poor, really poor. And what we can see, and this is great because it ties in nicely what Ross was highlighting at the beginning. When I go back to October 2017, I can see he was poor, because I was using yellow back then, poor for pretty much the majority of his tests. But the greens didn't really come along until he was in the second year for the under-18s. So back then, that's when maturation doesn't really take into consideration anymore. So we can see, because we've got good long-term athletic development data, we can actually see how he progresses long-term over the programme. And we can actually see, yeah, when he was younger, he was really, really poor. He was a later developer. But once he went through that growth spurt, maturational differences, they become eradicated. We can see he's good. He's a real athlete. And I can actually tell you right now, that lad is one of the only few lads out of that age group which is playing professional football right now. So, in a very, very quick nutshell, that was football fitness and growth and maturation. And I'm just going to leave you with one of the greatest late developer and players in Scottish football right now.